August 1944. The military transport truck lurches to a stop outside Amarillo, Texas, and 23 German women brace themselves against wooden benches. Dust rises through the canvas flaps. Lisa Minhart, 24 years old, former Luftwaffe radio operator, can see nothing but Texas sky through the opening. Endless, blue, impossibly wide. She presses her zip-tied wrists against her stomach and waits for the shouting to begin. The canvas tears back. Sunlight floods in. A man stands in the doorframe, backlit, wearing a tan Stetson and rolled sleeves, not a military uniform. Dust coats his boots. He extends his hand toward the nearest woman. "Ma'am, watch your step." His voice is calm, almost gentle. The accent is strange, drawling, nothing like the clipped English she learned from propaganda broadcasts. This isn't a guard. This is a cowboy. The word surfaces from memories of pre-war American films she watched in Berlin, Western heroes on horseback, fiction, propaganda itself, she'd been told. But here stands a man who looks torn from those fabricated images, offering his hand to an enemy of the state. Lisa doesn't take it. None of them do. They file out into the blinding heat, boots hitting red dirt, blinking against a sun that feels different from the one that rose over bombed-out Berlin. Behind the cowboy stretches an impossibility: wooden ranch buildings, horses in corrals, no barbed wire towers, no concrete bunkers, just Texas, raw and sprawling and nothing like the cage of steel and fire she'd prepared herself to enter. What happens next will shatter everything Nazi propaganda taught her about Americans, about revenge, about what enemies do to each other when the cameras stop rolling and the world isn't watching. But first, you need to understand who Lisa Minhart was before that truck door opened. Berlin, 1939. She was 19 when the war began, working as a telephone operator for the Postal Service. Efficient, unremarkable, patriotic in the way young people are when the entire nation vibrates with purpose and power. The Reich needed bodies, it needed skills. By 1940 they needed women. The Luftwaffe recruited her in early 1941, not to fly, not to fight, to listen. Radio operations, intercepting Allied transmissions, relaying coordinates, managing communication networks across North Africa. She was good at it. Fast fingers, sharp ears, attention to detail that superiors noticed and rewarded with commendations. By 1942, she was stationed in Tunisia, part of Rommel's Africa Corps support network. The propaganda came with the uniform, daily briefings, weekly rallies, constant reinforcement. She learned that Americans were weak, soft, divided by racial impurity and Jewish manipulation, incapable of the discipline and unity the Reich embodied. If Germany lost, an impossibility she was assured of, the victors would exact biblical vengeance, camps, executions, slave labor in factories until bodies broke. She believed it. Why wouldn't she? The evidence seemed everywhere: German victories across Europe, the strength of the Wehrmacht, the righteous fury of a nation reclaiming its destiny. Doubt wasn't an option. Doubt was defeatism, and defeatism was treason. Then came May 1943. Tunisia collapsed. Rommel retreated. The Africa Corps crumbled. Lisa found herself in a truck convoy racing toward Tunis, radio equipment abandoned, British forces closing in from 3 directions. She remembers the sound of artillery, the way her commanding officer's hands shook when he ordered them to burn documents. The silence when American infantry surrounded their position. They surrendered on May 12th, 1943, 15 months before that Amarillo truck door opened. The capture itself was anticlimactic. American soldiers, young and tired, processed them with bored efficiency. No beatings, no executions, just paperwork, fingerprints, medical examinations. Lisa waited for the cruelty to begin. Surely this was theatre. Perform civility for the Red Cross observers, then unleash the real treatment once witnesses vanished. It never came. They were shipped to a British-run facility in North Africa first. Camps, barbed wire, guards with rifles. That part matched expectations, but the food arrived regularly. The medical staff treated illnesses. The Red Cross inspectors had access. Slowly, reluctantly, Lisa began to suspect that international law might actually apply to her. Not out of kindness, out of bureaucratic obligation. She was a resource to be managed, not an enemy to be destroyed. Still, she waited. America would be different. America had been attacked. America had lost sons. Surely when she reached the mainland, the mask would slip. The Atlantic crossing took 11 days in the cargo hold of a Liberty ship. Seasickness, darkness, the mechanical groan of engines. When they docked in New York Harbor in July 1944, Lisa climbed above deck and saw the Manhattan skyline through morning fog. It stood intact, every building whole, no rubble, no burn marks, no evidence that war had touched this city at all. She thought of Berlin, of the RAF bombing raids that turned neighborhoods into craters, of sleeping in subway tunnels, of the smell of phosphorus and burning flesh that clung to everything. And here was New York, gleaming, untouched, operating at full capacity while Europe tore itself apart. The scale of it struck her silent. This wasn't a nation struggling to survive. This was a nation that had mobilized only a fraction of its power and already turned the tide of the war. The propaganda had lied about American weakness. That much became undeniable. But what about American cruelty? That remained to be seen. They processed her at Fort Dix. More paperwork, more medical checks. She was classified as a non-combatant auxiliary, a designation that apparently mattered to the Americans. Combatants went to different camps, harsher camps. The women, all 23 of them from the Tunisia capture, were assigned to a labor program. Agricultural support, the processing officer explained through a translator. Texas, ranching, you'll work. You'll be compensated according to Geneva Convention standards. Cooperate, and you'll be treated fairly. The translator was a German-American from Milwaukee. He looked uncomfortable. Lisa wondered if he had family in Germany, if he thought about them when he processed enemy prisoners, if he hated her. She asked him, "What happens if we don't cooperate?" He stared at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Lady, you're going to Texas. Cowboys don't waste time on people who won't work. You'll cooperate." It wasn't a threat. It was a prediction. The train west took 3 days. They traveled in a passenger car, not a cattle car. Guarded, yes, restricted, certainly, but seated, with windows. Lisa watched America scroll past like a documentary film. Farmland, factories, small towns with church steeples, cities that glittered at night with electric lights that faced no blackout restrictions. Everywhere, abundance. Everywhere, normalcy. The other women whispered to each other. Greta, 31, former munitions factory worker from Stuttgart, pressed her face against the glass and murmured, "There's no war here." "How is there no war here?" Annalisa, 27, former school teacher from Hamburg, said quietly, "Because we didn't bring it to them. We tried. We failed." Lisa said nothing. She watched the landscape and tried to reconcile the propaganda with the reality. Americans were supposed to be on the brink of collapse, divided, weakened. Instead, the nation hummed with industrial might and untouched infrastructure. The Reich had awoken something it couldn't control. She understood that now. The admirals on the Shokaku understood it in August 1942. Lisa understood it in August 1944 watching Iowa cornfields blur past, but understanding didn't prepare her for Texas. The truck picked them up at the Amarillo train station. Military transport, canvas cover, wooden benches, the last leg of a journey that began in Berlin 5 years earlier. Lisa sat near the back, wrists zip-tied as a formality, watching dust devils spin across the plains. Texas looked like Mars, red earth, scrub brush, horizons so distant they curved. The heat was different from North Africa, drier, heavier, the kind of heat that made you understand why everything moved slowly here, why buildings had wide porches, why men wore wide-brimmed hats. The truck slowed, stopped. Canvas flaps tore back. And there he was, cowboy, real, flesh and blood, Stetson, boots, drawl. "Ma'am, watch your step." They stepped down into a ranch compound that looked nothing like a prison. Wooden bunkhouse. Corral with horses. Main building that might have been a farmhouse once, expanded with additions. A barn. A water tower. Everything functional, everything worn by use, not neglect. A man in his 40s emerged from the main building. Tall, lean, face weathered by sun and wind. He wore the same practical clothing as the cowboy who'd helped them from the truck. Rolled sleeves, denim, dust. He stopped 10 feet away and looked at them with an expression Lisa couldn't read. "My name's Ray Hutchins," he said. The translator repeated it in German. "I run this ranch. You'll work here until the war ends, or until someone decides otherwise. We've got cattle to move, fences to mend, and about 1,000 things that need doing. You'll earn your keep." He paused, studied them. "I know what you expected. I know what they told you about America. But here's what's true. You'll work hard, you'll be fed fair, and you'll be treated like ranch hands. Not prisoners, not slaves. Ranch hands, you do your job, we'll get along fine, but you cause trouble, we'll deal with it. Simple as that." The translator finished. Silence settled. Lisa waited for the conditions, the threats, the leverage. Instead, Ray said, "Hungry?" They were led to a mess hall attached to the bunkhouse. Beef stew, cornbread, coffee, real food, hot, plentiful. Better than the rations Lisa had eaten in North Africa. Better than anything she'd had in months. The women ate in silence, waiting for someone to take it away, to reveal it as a test. No one did. After the meal, they were assigned bunks, shown the washing facilities, given work clothes, plain, practical, not uniforms, not prison stripes, just shirts and trousers and boots sized appropriately. A woman named Margaret, middle-aged, American, civilian, explained the schedule through the translator. Up at dawn, breakfast, work until lunch, work until dinner. Evenings are yours, lights out at 9, Sundays you rest. Greta asked, "What if we refuse?" Margaret looked at her like she'd asked a stupid question. "Then you don't eat, and you don't last long, but I don't figure you're stupid enough to refuse." She wasn't wrong. That first night, Lisa lay in a bunk that had a real mattress, in a room with windows that had no bars, and tried to make sense of the day. The propaganda had prepared her for camps, for brutality, for the kind of vengeance that victors exact on the defeated. Instead, she'd been given stew and a job. Annalise whispered from the next bunk, "This doesn't make sense." "No," Lisa agreed. "Maybe it gets worse. Maybe." But the doubt crept in. Maybe it didn't. Maybe this was exactly what it appeared to be, pragmatic use of available labor during a manpower shortage. Maybe Americans simply didn't see the point in cruelty when efficiency served better. Or maybe, and this thought scared her more than any beating could have, maybe the propaganda had been wrong about everything. Morning arrived with a bell, sharp, insistent, dawn breaking pink and orange over the panhandle. The women dressed in work clothes that smelled like soap and sun. Breakfast was eggs and bacon and biscuits, coffee strong enough to burn. Cowboys ate at the same tables, ignoring them mostly, occasionally nodding if eye contact happened. After breakfast, Ray gathered them outside the corral. Behind him, horses shifted and snorted, a dozen of them, various colors, sizes, all of them looking enormous to women who'd never touched a horse in their lives. Lisa's heart started to pound, not from fear of violence, from fear of the unknown, from the recognition that whatever came next would be utterly outside her experience, outside her control. Ray walked toward the fence, gestured for them to follow. The cowboys stood nearby, holding saddles, bridles, ropes, tools of a trade Lisa didn't understand. Ray stopped in front of a chestnut mare with a white blaze down her face. The horse watched him with dark, intelligent eyes. He rested his hand on her neck, spoke to her softly. Then he turned to Lisa. "This here's Juniper," he said. The translator repeated it. Ray's eyes held something that might have been amusement, might have been challenge. "She's yours for the season." Lisa had never been this close to a horse. In Berlin, horses pulled delivery carts. In Tunisia, they existed in the distance, ridden by local farmers. But standing 3 feet from Juniper, she could smell the animal, hay, sweat, dust. The mare stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder. Muscle rippled beneath her coat. One hoof could crush bone. Ray held out a bridle. "First thing you learn is how to tack up. Watch." He demonstrated with slow, deliberate movements how to approach from the side, how to slip the bit into the mouth, how to settle the saddle without spooking the animal. His hands moved with the confidence of 30 years' practice. He made it look simple. It wasn't. When Lisa tried, Juniper tossed her head. The bit clanked against teeth. The bridle twisted. Lisa's hands shook from adrenaline and frustration. Behind her, she heard one of the other women, Greta, curse in German as her horse sidestepped away. A young cowboy, maybe 20, approached Greta's horse and steadied it with a hand on the shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured. To the horse or Greta, Lisa couldn't tell. He guided Greta's hands to the correct position, corrected her grip, didn't mock her, didn't smile at her incompetence, just taught. That was the first surprise, the patience. By the third attempt, Lisa got the bridle on correctly. Ray nodded. "Good. Now the saddle." The saddle weighed 40 pounds. Lisa hoisted it with both arms, staggered slightly, and swung it toward Juniper's back. It landed crooked. The stirrup caught on the mare's flank. Juniper danced sideways. Lisa stumbled back, heart hammering. Ray caught the saddle before it slipped. "You're rushing. Horse can feel that. Breathe. Try again." She wanted to snap at him, wanted to say that breathing wouldn't make the saddle lighter or the horse less enormous, but the translator stood nearby and pride kept her silent. She breathed, lifted, swung. This time the saddle settled properly. Ray showed her how to cinch it, how to check the tightness, how to adjust the stirrups. Each step was foreign. Each step required focus that pushed out everything else, the war, the propaganda, the fear. There was only the horse and the task, and the desperate desire not to fail in front of these Americans. "Now mount up." Lisa stared at the stirrup. It hung at chest height. Juniper stood rock still, but the ground seemed very far away. She grabbed the saddle horn, put her boot in the stirrup, and tried to pull herself up. Nothing happened. Her arms shook, her leg trembled. She couldn't lift her own weight. "Use your leg," Ray said. Push, don't pull." She tried again, pushed off the ground, swung her right leg over. For one glorious second she was airborne, ascending, succeeding. And then she overcorrected, momentum carrying her too far, and she tumbled directly over the saddle and hit the dirt on the opposite side. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. She lay in the dust, staring at the sky, humiliated, waiting for laughter, for mockery. Instead, Ray appeared above her, extending the same hand he'd offered at the truck. "Happens to everyone their first time. Get up." She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. "Again," he said. It took 7 attempts before she stayed in the saddle. 7 falls. 7 times hauling herself up from the dirt. By the end, her legs burned, her hands were raw, and her pride was shredded. But she sat on Juniper's back, gripping the reins, feeling the animal's breathing between her thighs. Ray swung onto his own horse with effortless grace. "Follow me, stay loose, let the horse do the work." They walked the horses around the corral. Just walking, nothing faster. But even that required balance Lisa didn't possess. Every step jolted her. The saddle felt like sitting on a wooden plank. Her spine compressed with each movement. She gritted her teeth and tried to mimic Ray's posture, straight back, relaxed shoulders, hips moving with the horse's gait. 15 minutes in, something clicked. Her body found the rhythm. The jolting smoothed into a rocking motion. Juniper's steps became predictable. Lisa's breathing steadied. Ray noticed. "There you go, you're riding." It was the smallest accomplishment, the most basic skill any ranch hand possessed. But in that moment, sitting on a horse in Texas, Lisa felt something she hadn't felt since before the war: competence. The work began in earnest the next morning. The women were divided into groups. Lisa, Greta, Annalisa, and 3 others were assigned to Ray and 2 cowboys, the young one named Jack and an older man called simply Dutch. Their task: move a herd of cattle from the southern pasture to grazing land closer to the ranch. It sounded simple. It was chaos. Cattle didn't follow instructions. They scattered. They bolted at shadows. They moved in every direction except the one you needed. Lisa spent the first 2 hours simply trying to keep Juniper between the strays and the open plains. Her thighs ached. Her hands blistered from the reins. Sweat soaked through her shirt. But slowly, painfully, she learned where to position the horse, how to anticipate which direction a steer would run, when to push and when to let the animal settle. The cowboys called instructions in English she only half understood, but tone and gesture filled the gaps. And this wasn't classroom learning, this was baptism by necessity. By midday the herd was contained and moving. Ray rode up beside her, tipped his hat back and said, "You'll do." 2 words, nothing profound, but they landed like a commendation from a commanding officer. Lunch was eaten in the saddle. Sandwiches wrapped in cloth passed around by Jack, beef and cheese on thick bread. Lisa devoured hers, hunger overriding any thought about propriety. Across the herd, she saw Greta doing the same. Their eyes met. Greta's expression mirrored what Lisa felt: exhaustion mixed with something unexpected: satisfaction. The afternoon brought mending fences. They dismounted near the southern boundary, and Dutch demonstrated how to replace broken wire, tighten posts, secure the line. Manual labor. Blisters on top of blisters, but the cowboys worked alongside them. Same tasks, same heat, no hierarchy beyond experience. Jack worked next to Annalisa, showing her how to twist wire properly. He spoke slowly, using simple English, gesturing when words failed. Annalisa, who'd taught English literature in Hamburg, responded in careful, accented sentences. A conversation emerged. halting, awkward, but real. "You speak good," Jack said. "I taught English before." Annalise didn't specify before what. She didn't need to. Jack nodded. "Well, it's better than my German, which is none." Annalise smiled. It was the first smile Lisa had seen from any of them since Tunisia. The cultural exchange happened in small moments, during water breaks, over evening meals, in the bunkhouse after lights out. The Cowboys were curious about Germany. Not the Third Reich, not the politics, but the place itself. What did Berlin look like? What did people eat? What were winters like? The questions were asked, without malice, simple curiosity, the same questions anyone might ask a traveller from a foreign land. It disarmed Lisa. She'd expected hatred, suspicion. Instead, she got, "I heard you folks have festivals with beer and music, and that true?" She found herself describing Oktoberfest to Jack. The tents, the bands, the pretzels the size of dinner plates. He listened with genuine interest, then told her about the rodeo circuit, the bull riding, the barrel racing, the way entire towns turned out for the competition. "You have cowboys who ride bulls for entertainment?" Lisa asked. "Sure do. 8 seconds, you win. Get thrown before that." "Well," Jack grinned, "you get hurt." "That's insane." "Yeah, it's great." In another context, this would have been absurd. Enemy nationals discussing cultural traditions like colleagues at a dinner party. But in the Texas heat, after 12 hours of shared labor, the lines blurred. Greta asked Dutch how he'd learned to rope. He spent 30 minutes teaching her basic lasso technique, laughing, not unkindly, when her loops collapsed before reaching the practice post. "Took me 2 years to get decent," he said. "You've got 3 months, no pressure." The humor diffused something, made the work feel less like punishment and more like training. But the propaganda didn't release its grip easily. At night, Lisa lay awake and wrestled with cognitive dissonance. These men were the enemy. They fought for a nation that bombed Dresden, that killed German soldiers by the thousands, yet they taught her to ride, fed her, treated her injuries, the blisters, the saddle sores, the sunburn, with the same medical supplies they used themselves. She wanted to distrust it, to find the angle, the exploitation. But the truth was undeniable. The ranch needed labor, the prisoners needed purpose, and pragmatism created an arrangement that benefited both. No cruelty was necessary. Efficiency sufficed. Still, she wondered what they thought of her. If Ray saw her as a Nazi, if Jack knew what the Luftwaffe did to London, if Dutch had lost someone in the war. The answer came in early November. They were moving cattle again, a smaller herd this time, when one of the cows went into labor, complicated labor. The calf was breech. The cow bellowed, thrashing, unable to complete the birth. Ray dismounted immediately, called for rope and towels. "We lose this calf, we lose money," he said. "Might lose the mother too." He knelt in the dirt, talking softly to the cow, assessing the situation. Lisa had assisted with births before, not cattle, but the principles were similar. She dismounted without thinking. "I can help," she said in broken English. Ray glanced at her, nodded. "Hold her steady." The next 20 minutes were blood and fluid and desperation. Lisa held the cow's head, murmuring in German, soothing nonsense words that the animal couldn't understand but responded to anyway. Ray worked with his hands inside the birth canal, trying to reposition the calf. Sweat poured down his face. The cow kicked, nearly caught him in the ribs. "Got it," Ray grunted. "One more push." The calf slid free, wet, motionless. Ray cleared its airway, rubbed it vigorously with a towel. For 10 terrible seconds, nothing. Then the calf coughed, gasped, breathed. The cow lowed, turned her head, began licking her newborn. Ray sat back in the dirt, covered in birth fluids, chest heaving. He looked at Lisa. Good work. She stared at the calf, at the life that hadn't been lost, at Ray's hands, still shaking slightly from adrenaline. She wanted to say something meaningful, something that bridged the gap between captor and prisoner, between German and American. Instead, she said, "The cow did the hard part." Ray laughed, actual laughter. "Yeah, she did." That evening, after the herd was settled and the equipment cleaned, Ray approached Lisa at the corral fence. She was watching Juniper graze, her body aching in a dozen places but her mind quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Ray said. Lisa tensed. "Yes." "You ever wonder why we're treating you like this?" It was the question she'd been afraid to ask. "Every day." Ray leaned against the fence, pulled out a cigarette, offered her one. She shook her head. He lit his own, exhaled smoke that drifted into the dusk. "My brother died at Normandy," he said quietly. "June 6th, first wave, didn't make it off the beach." Lisa's stomach dropped. I'm sorry." "Yeah, me too." Ray took another drag. "I could hate you for that. Could hate all of you. Some folks do. My mother, she can't even hear a German accent without leaving the room." He paused, studied the ember of his cigarette. "But you didn't kill him. War did." "And I ain't going to become something ugly just because the world is. You're here. You work. You're capable. That's all that matters on a ranch." Lisa didn't know what to say. The calculus was so simple, so different from the ideology she'd been raised in. Judge by competence, judge by action, not by blood, not by nation. "I spent a lot of time angry," Ray continued. "Lot of time wanting someone to pay. Then I realized that's a hole with no bottom. You can throw everything into it, your time, your soul, your future, and it'll never fill up. So I chose different. I chose to do my job and treat people fair and let the politicians sort out the rest." He flicked the cigarette into the dirt, crushed it under his boot. "You're good with the horses," he said, "and you probably saved that calf today. That counts for something. Here. Anyway." He walked away before Lisa could respond. She stood at the fence as darkness settled over the panhandle, watching the first stars appear, and felt something crack inside her. Not break, crack, like ice on a river in early spring. The propaganda had taught her that enemies were monsters, that compassion was weakness, that hatred was strength. Ray had just proven all of it wrong with a cigarette and a quiet conversation. December arrived. The first snow dusted the panhandle on a Sunday morning, light and unexpected. Lisa had never associated Texas with snow, but here it was, thin and delicate, melting almost as soon as it touched the ground. She'd been at the ranch 4 months. Juniper responded to her touch now. Her hands had calluses in all the right places. She could rope a post 3 times out of 5. She understood enough English to follow most conversations. The other women had transformed similarly. Greta could mend fence faster than Jack. Annalisa had learned to bake biscuits that the Cowboys requested specifically. They were becoming ranch hands, not prisoners. Ranch hands. That evening, Lisa sat on the corral fence, watching the sun set over land that looked nothing like home. Berlin was likely in ruins by now, Soviet forces advancing from the east, Allied bombers turning her city into rubble. Her family, her mother, her sister, she hadn't heard from them in 18 months. Didn't know if they were alive. The guilt of safety pressed down on her. She was here, in Texas, learning to ride horses and birth calves while her country burned. Footsteps approached. Ray. He didn't say anything, just stood next to the fence and handed her a tin cup of coffee. Steam rose into the cold air. They stood in silence, two people on opposite sides of a war, sharing coffee as the sky turned orange and purple. There was nothing to say, no words that could reconcile the contradiction of this moment. Enemy and ally, prisoner and teacher, German and American, just two humans waiting for the world to stop burning. Lisa sipped the coffee. It was hot, bitter, perfect. Juniper grazed nearby, unconcerned with the complexities of war and politics and national identity. The horse only cared about grass and water and whether the hands that fed her were kind. Maybe, Lisa thought, that was the whole lesson right there, May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended on a Tuesday. The announcement came over the radio in the ranch house during lunch, President Truman's voice crackling through static, declaring unconditional German surrender, victory in Europe, VE Day. The Cowboys erupted in cheers, hats flew, someone produced a bottle of whiskey that had been saved for exactly this moment. The German women sat at their table in silence. Lisa felt numb, not surprised, everyone had known the end was coming for months, but hollowed out nonetheless. The Reich was finished. Hitler was dead. Everything she'd been raised to believe in, everything she'd served, had collapsed into rubble and ash. Across the mess hall, Ray caught her eye. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate in her direction, just nodded once, acknowledgement. Not of victory, but of the moment's weight. The celebration continued around them, but Lisa couldn't feel it. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Berlin was being divided by armies. Her mother, if she'd survived, was living under occupation. Her city was a graveyard, and Lisa was in Texas, safe, fed, alive. The guilt was crushing. The repatriation process began within a week. Military officials arrived with paperwork, medical examinations, interviews. The POWs would be shipped back to Germany once transportation was arranged, likely within a month, maybe two. Lisa should have felt relief. She was going home. But home was an abstract concept now. The Berlin she remembered didn't exist anymore. The country she'd known had been erased. What waited for her was uncertainty, occupation, and the hard work of survival in a nation that would have to reckon with what it had done. The ranch continued operating. There was still work to be done, cattle to move, fences to mend. The war's end didn't change the fact that grass still grew and animals still needed tending. So they worked. Germans and Americans side by side, waiting for the bureaucracy to process them out. It was Greta who noticed it first. "They're being kind to us," she said one evening in the bunkhouse. "More than before." She was right. The Cowboys brought them extra coffee, shared cigarettes. Dutch spent an entire afternoon teaching Annalisa advanced roping techniques she'd never need. Jack gave Greta his spare gloves when hers wore through. They were saying goodbye, in the only way Cowboys knew how. Late May. The repatriation date was set, June 15th, 3 weeks away. Ray called a meeting after dinner. The women gathered in the mess hall expecting instructions, paperwork, logistics. Instead, Ray and the other Cowboys carried in a wooden crate. They set it on the table and stepped back. "We took up a collection," Ray said. The translator repeated his words. "Figured you'd need supplies when you get back. So we put together some things." He opened the crate. Inside, canned food, blankets, soap, sewing kits, first aid supplies. Practical items, things that would be scarce in occupied Germany, things that cost money these men didn't have much of. Lisa stared at the contents, at the evidence of generosity from people who had every reason to give nothing. "And one more thing," Ray said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a horseshoe, old iron, worn smooth. He set it on the table. "Juniper threw this last month. Figured you might want it. You know, to remember." The other cowboys produced similar items, horseshoes from the various mounts the women had ridden, small pieces of metal that meant nothing and everything. Lisa picked up Juniper's shoe. It was heavy, real, a physical piece of this impossible experience. "Thank you," she managed in English. Her voice cracked. Ray nodded, uncomfortable with emotion, like most men who spent their lives working with their hands rather than their words. "You earned it." The night before departure, Lisa couldn't sleep. She left the bunkhouse and walked to the corral. Juniper stood near the fence, dozing. The mare's ears flicked forward when Lisa approached. "Hey, girl," Lisa murmured. She'd said it 100 times over 8 months. The words had become automatic. Natural. She stroked Juniper's neck. The horse leaned into the touch, content. Lisa wondered who would ride her next. If the mare would notice her absence, if horses remembered the hands that fed and rode them. Footsteps behind her, she didn't turn. "Couldn't sleep either," Ray's voice. "No." He joined her at the fence, lit a cigarette, offered her one. This time she took it. He lit it for her, and she inhaled smoke that burned her throat and steadied her nerves. "Can I ask you something?" Lisa said. "Sure." "Why did you do this?" "Really?" Ray was quiet for a long moment. Smoke drifted between them. "Because somebody has to remember we're human first," he finally said. "Even in war, especially in war, the minute we forget that, we become the thing we're fighting against." He took a drag. Exhaled. "You're not the Reich, you're Lisa. You work hard, you're good with animals, you saved a calf. That's what I know about you. That's what matters here." Lisa felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "In Germany, they taught us you would torture us, kill us, that Americans were barbaric. Yeah, we heard similar things about you. But you didn't, because propaganda's easy," Ray interrupted. "Seeing people is harder. But it's the only thing that survives when the shooting stops." He dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his boot. The same gesture as their conversation months ago, full circle. "You're going to go back to a hard situation," he said. "Occupied country, rebuilding, lots of people angry at Germany, and rightfully so, but you keep your head down, you work hard. You use what you learned here, you'll be all right." "I don't know if I deserve to be all right." Ray looked at her. "That's not for me to decide, but I know you can ride a horse, birth a calf and mend a fence. That's honest work. And honest work is a good place to start rebuilding a life." Lisa wiped her eyes. "I'll miss this place." "Yeah, it has a way of getting into you." They stood in silence. Two people who should have been enemies, who'd become something else entirely. Not quite friends, not quite allies. Something without a name. Something the war hadn't prepared either of them for. "You rode good, Lisa," Ray said quietly. It was the highest compliment a cowboy could give. June 15th, 1945. The trucks arrived at dawn, the same trucks that had brought them 8 months earlier. The women loaded their few possessions, the supplies from the cowboys, the horseshoes, the work clothes they'd been allowed to keep. The ranch hands gathered to see them off. Handshakes. Awkward hugs. Jack gave Annalise a small book of English poetry. Dutch gave Greta an actual lasso, coiled and tied. "You got pretty good," he said. "Don't waste it." Lisa stood in front of Ray. She wanted to say something profound, something that captured the transformation this place had worked on her, on all of them. Instead, she extended her hand. "Thank you." Ray shook it. His grip was firm, calloused, the hand of a man who'd spent his life working. Good luck. She climbed into the truck, took her seat. The canvas flaps remained open. As the convoy rolled out, Lisa watched the ranch shrink in the distance, the corral, the bunkhouse, the main building, and Juniper standing at the fence, watching them leave. The Texas sky was impossibly blue, just like the day she'd arrived, but everything else had changed. The return to Germany was everything she'd feared. Berlin was rubble, entire neighborhoods erased. Her family's apartment building had taken a direct hit in early 1945. Her mother and sister had survived, barely, and were living in a displaced persons camp in the British sector. The reunion was tearful, complicated. Lisa had left as a loyal radio operator for the Luftwaffe. She returned as something else, someone who'd learned that enemies could extend hands instead of fists, that propaganda was easier than truth, that cowboys were real and more honorable than the regime she'd served. She didn't talk about Texas much. How could she explain it? How could she tell her mother, who'd survived bombing raids and starvation, that her captors had taught her to ride horses and treated her fairly? But she kept the horseshoe, hung it on the wall of whatever space they occupied, through the displacement camp, through the years of rebuilding, through her eventual marriage to a schoolteacher in 1950, through the births of her children, through the construction of the Berlin Wall, through reunification. The horseshoe stayed. The historical record shows that the treatment Lisa and her fellow POWs received was unusual. Not unique, many German POWs in America were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, but uncommon in its genuine integration. Most camps maintained strict separation between captors and prisoners. Most labor was done under guard, not alongside civilian workers. The Texas ranch program was born of necessity. Labor shortages during the war demanded creative solutions. But it was sustained by something else, a cowboy culture that valued competence over politics, work ethic over nationality, and practical results over ideological purity. Not all American POW camps operated this way. Some were harsh, some were punitive, and the conditions in Soviet camps were nightmarish by comparison. Lisa knew she'd been extraordinarily fortunate. That knowledge carried its own weight. In 1947, 2 years after the war's end, Lisa wrote a letter. She'd found Ray's address through Red Cross records, a long shot that somehow worked. The letter was written in careful English, translated and checked by her husband. It said, in part, "Dear Mr. Hutchins, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to tell you that I survived the return, and my family survived the war. Berlin is slowly rebuilding. It is hard work, but I learned from the best. I think often of the ranch, of Juniper, of the men who taught an enemy to ride horses instead of chaining her. I learned more about humanity on your ranch than in all my years in the Reich. The cowboys were real, the propaganda was the fiction. You asked me once if I wondered why you treated us as you did. I understand now kindness isn't weakness, it's the hardest choice. And it's the only one that builds something instead of destroying. Thank you for teaching me to ride. Thank you for remembering I was human first. With gratitude, Lisa Minhart Weber." The letter was discovered in 1993 in a Texas historical archive, along with Ray's response, a brief note confirming he remembered her and wished her well. Both letters are now preserved as part of a small exhibit on POW programs in the American Southwest during World War II. Lisa lived until 1982. She worked as a translator during the Reconstruction, raised 3 children, saw her city divided, and toward the end of her life, glimpsed the possibility of its reunification. She never returned to Texas, never rode a horse again, but the horseshoe hung on her wall until the day she died. Her daughter, going through her mother's effects, asked why she kept it, why a piece of old iron from a horse thousands of miles away mattered so much. Lisa's response, recorded in her daughter's journal, "Because it reminds me that even in the darkest times, some people choose to be human, and that choice changes everything." The horseshoe now belongs to Lisa's granddaughter. It hangs in a home in Munich, a piece of Texas iron carrying a lesson that transcends borders and decades. That hatred is easy, that propaganda is convenient, that seeing enemies as monsters requires no courage, but seeing them as people, working beside them, teaching them, extending a hand instead of a fist, that requires everything. And sometimes, in the middle of a war that consumed the world, a few cowboys on a Texas ranch chose everything. They chose to remember that we're human first, even when the world forgot, especially then.